So I recently came upon a video from something called the World Video Bible School, which sounds like an actual and likely accredited institution of real learning, in which well-known apologist Kyle Butt discusses Bible contradictions. Now, I'm always curious when I see apologists address this topic. Not because I expect them to actually reconcile these contradictions, since they never do, but because I have a certain train wreck fascination with watching them try. The mental contortion people go through to explain why the Bible isn't saying two contradictory things when it's clearly saying two contradictory things is just plain weird. So watching Kyle try to address this topic should tell us a lot about his strategy for dealing with his apologetic audience, and by implication the quality and type of argument he thinks they expect from him. But okay, he is a fairly well-known apologist, so instead of calling him by his first name, I think I should show him the respect of being just a little more formal. So from this point forward, I will be referring to him as Mr. Butt. Furthermore, because of the gravity of this topic and the sober, detailed approach I'm sure he's going to take with it, I'll refrain from making him the butt of too many more jokes. There we go.
When you hold the Bible, lots of times you think about it as one book. The fact of the matter is, however, it's not one book. It's 66 different books. And those 66 different books were written over a period of about 1,600 years. The first 5 books of the Old Testament written by Moses were written in about 1450 BC.
Now I already have to take issue with something here. Aside from the very iffy date he gives for the writing of the Pentateuch, his claim that Moses composed these first 5 books is not only questionable, but almost certainly wrong. For one, there's no good historical basis for thinking Moses even existed. And what's more, Genesis is obviously a sloppy patchwork of varying text, not only from different authors, but from totally different traditions. I won't get too far into this for the sake of time, but the fact is there's no f***ing way on earth one person wrote Genesis, much less that we can say it's Moses. And even if you want to ignore everything I've said up to this point, let's not forget that Deuteronomy includes the account of Moses' death and burial. So unless you think Moses wrote that, the question of the Pentateuch's authorship is at least more complicated than Mr. Butt is making it sound. So already, at 23 seconds into this video, we've established that he's clearly playing to a friendly audience who shares his own assumptions.
The last book of the New Testament, the book of Revelation, was penned well before 100 AD. So over those 1,600 years, about 40 different men penned these 66 books. And these men came from all different walks of life. Some of them were kings, some of them were shepherds, some of them were tax collectors, and yet all 66 fit together like perfect pieces of a puzzle.
Ignoring all the factual assumptions Mr. Butt is making, I'm guessing his strategy is to imply that, due to the varying authors and span of time across which the Bible was written, we should expect at least some slight variation in how these stories are told. Not only that, but it's absolutely marvelous, nay miraculous, that the Bible manages to remain accurate. Because if he's not at least trying to plant this idea in people's heads, I can't see where he's going here. Unless he just hopes to eat up time without talking about actual Bible contradictions. Probably a little of both.
Skeptics have gone to the Bible and said, no, they don't fit together. They are filled with contradictions where one author will say something over here and contradict something that another author says over there. But the fact of the matter is, not a single legitimate contradiction has ever been pointed out. In fact, people have searched for hundreds and hundreds of years for these contradictions, and they haven't found a single legitimate one.
This is pretty standard apologetic fare. Mr. Butt has to prep his audience with a narrative of how all the mean old skeptics out there have gone out of their way to attack the faith. In this case, claiming they've been sitting there for centuries scouring the Bible in a desperate attempt to find something wrong with it. Because of course they're just assholes with an axe to grind, and any contradiction they come up with was the result of a long-running attempt to twist the Bible's words. But of course this is flat nonsense. The Bible's contradictions are plainly obvious, and far from having to search for them, I found them jumping off the page at me even as a Christian. But the real point here is that nobody with a serious, well-founded argument needs this kind of language to characterize the opposition. This is simple narrative building designed to encourage an inward-looking fortress mentality. It reeks of demagoguery, and it's a strong sign that the speaker's full of crap. But then who would guess we'd see so much crap coming out of Mr. Butt, huh?
Not long ago, I was presenting a seminar on creation and evolution, and at the end of it, a young man came to me and he said, "Yeah, I hear what you're saying about there being a God, and I think I'd probably have to agree with that, but you have to admit the Bible is full of errors." And I said, "Excuse me, I don't have to admit that because I've never seen a legitimate error in the Bible. I've never seen a contradiction." He said, "Oh yeah, the Bible's full of them." And he opened a folder, a 3-ring binder folder, and he showed me a page that had literally hundreds of alleged Bible contradictions on it, but they were in looked like about 0.3 font, tiny. You almost had to have a magnifying glass to read it. And he said, "Look, here are hundreds of them." And I bent down to look, and he closed it, and he said, "There are so many, you have to admit the Bible is full of errors." And then I asked him, "Have you looked at any single one of those, and which one do you think is the strongest?" He admitted, well, he hadn't looked at any single one. He just thought there were so many that one of them at least had to be a legitimate contradiction.
Bull. No f***ing way this happened. And there are a few things about this that I want to run through really quickly. 1. I want to point out that Mr. Butt just spent a full minute and 10 seconds on a story about a strawman atheist that we know he made up. 2nd, he actually claims that a skeptic walked up to him and said, "Well, clearly I can't deny God's existence after hearing your arguments," and he actually expects people to believe this. This makes it absurdly obvious not only that he's speaking to a friendly crowd, but that he knows this crowd lives on a planet so far away from the actual conversation between atheists and theists that he can represent these encounters however he wants. And finally, when he claims the skeptic never looked at a single contradiction but just assumed the Bible was full of them, Mr. Butt's lying and he f***ing knows he's lying. That's all that deserves to be said about this.
Well, the fact of the matter is there are lists of hundreds and sometimes even thousands of alleged contradictions. But never has there been a single legitimate contradiction pointed out. And that's why so many people still believe the Bible, because the Bible has been scrutinized and analyzed and put under the microscope of skepticism, and yet, for all that work, not a single legitimate contradiction. Let's look at some of those alleged contradictions and see how this works.
So almost a full 3 minutes into this 7-minute and 52-second video, Mr. Butt has done nothing but provide useless background information, harass strawman atheists, and repeatedly assured his audience that Bible contradictions don't exist. From here, he's going to explain 3 of what he calls alleged contradictions, all of which he picks himself. Because that's a useful exercise, right?
In John chapter 5, verse 31, Jesus himself said, "If I bear witness of myself, my witness is not true." But then over in John chapter 8, verse 14, the Bible says, Jesus answered and said to them, "Even if I bear witness of myself, my witness is true." Now the skeptic stops you right there and says, "Hold on just a second. That's obviously a contradiction. In one place, Jesus said, 'My witness is not true,' and in another place, he said, 'My witness is true.' What is the situation? That's got to be contradictory." No, it's not contradictory at all. In fact, the main problem or issue with these 2 verses is the translation of the word true there. It actually should say valid or something like that, because what Jesus is simply saying is, if I were in a court of law and I were testifying that I'm God and it were just me, then that wouldn't be valid testimony. But when someone else like John the Baptist or the voice from heaven, God, testifies that I am the Son of God, that is multiple witness, multiple attestation to what I said. In fact, if you go down just a few verses from that 2nd verse there in John 8, Jesus said, "It is also written in your law that the testimony of 2 men is," what? "True." Well, what he means by that is valid. The law recognized that 2 people had to witness to something for it to be valid in court. So Jesus was saying, I'm God, and I say that I am, and that is true, but in your court it wouldn't be presented as valid, and so I'll give you other witnesses, John the Baptist, the Holy Spirit, the voice coming down from God. That's not a contradiction.
I can get the argument he's making, and this might not be a clear-cut contradiction. However, Jesus' combined explanations here are still at best confusing and extremely unclear. In John 5:31, he says his lone testimony is untrue, or to accommodate Mr. Butt, invalid. Yet in John 8:14, he says that his lone testimony is valid on grounds that he has knowledge that the Pharisees don't. Taken in isolation, these 2 verses do appear to contradict each other, regardless of how we allow an apologist to swap between the words true and valid in these passages. Sure, John 8 does continue into a confusing mishmash of claims about when Jesus' sole testimony is valid and when he requires corroboration from the Father. But does this really help the situation? Let's take a quick look and see. Basically, Jesus starts by saying that he can vouch for himself on his sole testimony. but acknowledges in verse 15 that according to human law he needs a second witness to judge another person. Puzzlingly, he then seems to hint that he can testify alone in either situation because he carries the inherent weight of his Father's testimony when he speaks, even though the Father is never present. And this he bases solely on the bald-faced claim that if you knew me well enough, you'd know I was speaking for the Father, which frankly just makes Jesus sound like an arrogant, manipulative asshole. So let's be clear that there's no straightforward, clearly unified teaching here. But for the sake of argument, we'll say that Mr. Butt dodged a gotcha contradiction by appealing to how the words true and valid were translated from the original language. Assuming he wins this one, let's proceed.
What about the men who were with Paul hearing a voice? You see in Acts chapter 9, verse 7, the text says, and the men who journeyed with him, talking about Paul, stood speechless, hearing a voice but seeing no one. Did the men hear a voice? The text says that they did. But then you have Acts 22:9. Now those who were with me indeed saw the light and were afraid, but they did not hear the voice of him who spoke to me. Is that a contradiction? One says the men heard the voice, the other says the men did not hear the voice? No, not at all. In fact, what's going on there is if you were to read that in the original language, you would see that those words here in the two different verses are different statements or different spellings of the word. And here's why. Because the word here has multiple meanings. One is to detect a sound. The other is to understand what is said. All Paul was saying in the first instance was the men who were with me heard a sound. And then in the next instance, he was saying, but they did not understand what was said. If you've read your Bible, you know that Jesus said, he who has ears to hear, let him hear. What did Jesus mean? Let him detect the sound of my voice into his eardrum? No. He meant let him understand. So you just have multiple meanings of the word hear there.
I personally don't see this as much of a contradiction at all. Mr. Butt's argument here makes perfect sense, and in fact the phrasing used in the NIV states that the men did not understand the voice. So fine. He tossed himself a nice easy pitch and then knocked it out of the park. Well done, dude, I guess. But before we move on, I want to point out a pattern, which is that so far Mr. Butt has chosen verses that are at least arguably explained by how the original language was translated. This is a handy approach for apologists, because Christians rarely can and practically never will go back and check on the claim. They have a plausible sounding answer that might make the problem go away, and that's all they want. So let's just say that Mr. Butt successfully dealt with number 2, and we can flush this one away and move on to his final example.
Many times, skeptics accuse the New Testament books of contradicting themselves, especially in the resurrection accounts. When we look at Matthew chapter 28, verse 1, the text says, now after the Sabbath, as the first day of the week began to dawn, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to see the tomb. Who does this text say came to see the tomb? Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. But then Mark 16:1 says, now when the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices that they might come and anoint him. So which is it? Mary, or Mary, and Salome? You see, when one text adds information to another text, that's not a contradiction. That is an addition, it's supplementation, but it certainly is not a contradiction. If one of the texts had said, Mary and only the other Mary came to the tomb, well, that would be a contradiction, but it doesn't say that. In fact, one of them could have had another friend that's not mentioned in that text, and it wouldn't be contradictory.
Okay, fine. So it didn't say only the 2 women went to the tomb. But come on. How often do you think a person would sit down to write an account and, with full knowledge that 3 women did something, name 2 of them but not the third? Sure. It's possible that someone might have had a legitimate reason for this depending on the intended audience, but at best this is a clumsy and easily confused way to phrase an account. When someone names 2 and only 2 people as having done something, the clear implication is that they were, you got it, the only ones doing it. So when someone like Mr. Butt retorts, well, it doesn't use the word only, he's just being pedantic about the fact that you can't prove what a phrase pretty obviously means. And let's remember one more thing here, which is that in the big picture, he's not only trying to prove the Bible doesn't have technical contradictions, but that it's the pure, inerrant word of a perfect God. A God who knew these passages would end up in the same book where they could be compared with each other, yet allowed the author of Matthew to make a clumsy omission that looks at least questionable next to the other account. Is this likely? I'd say not. But can Mr. Butt say, nya, it isn't technically a contradiction? Sure. So for the sake of argument, he's 3 for 3 in this video.
Those simply aren't contradictions. Do you know we could do this all day long? We could go through the list of hundreds of alleged contradictions and show that they are not legitimate contradictions.
You want to do this all day? Okay, then let's. And let's start by just pointing out what Mr. Butt didn't share in his last example. Matthew 28 shows the 2 Marys already at the tomb when an angel shows up, rolls away the stone, and, with trembling guards present, tells them not to be afraid. Mark 16 shows the tomb already open when they get there, and the 3 women find a young man dressed in white robes as they enter. In Luke 24, 2 men appear to them, but only after they had entered and found Jesus' body was gone. And John 20 shows Mary Magdalene coming to the tomb and, after finding Jesus' body gone, going back to get the disciples. Only after they came back with her the second time and then leave, she looks into the tomb from the outside and sees 2 angels where Jesus' body had been. Then Jesus appears next to her and comforts her. Now obviously these 4 accounts are just riddled with obvious, irreconcilable contradictions. Unless you want to claim we're talking about an incomprehensibly weird series of events being described by 4 idiots who don't know how to summarize anything. Yet Mr. Butt, undoubtedly familiar with all the issues of this story, skimmed off an easy-to-explain question of who went to the tomb from the 2 most easily reconcilable books and pretended he'd accurately represented Bible contradictions. Still want to do this, Mr. Butt? Then how about the story of Judas's death? Matthew 27 describes Judas throwing his reward money at the priests in a fit of regret, then hanging himself at an undisclosed location. Only after this did the priests use the money to buy a field, which was named the Field of Blood because it was used for burials. Acts 1, on the other hand, shows Judas buying a field with the money and dying by falling headfirst when visiting it, and then says the field was called the Field of Blood because his guts went flying everywhere. These 2 stories obviously and without question contradict each other, and Christians' attempt at reconciling them are simply hilarious. But of course Mr. Butt avoided examples like this. The fact is, Mr. Butt's whole video is a bluff. Basically, he debunks 3 easy contradictions that he had chosen, as if that proves anything, then says I could do this all day, as if his self-selected soft pitches really represent the body of contradictions brought up by atheists. And the fact that he did this, and can get away with it, says a lot about him and his audience. See, most Christians don't confront Bible contradictions at all, and when they do, they deal with them by turning away and trying not to look too closely at them. And this isn't that hard to do most of the time, because the thing about internal contradictions is that you have to find and view 2 separate conflicting passages at the same time. So many Christians, unless they honestly want to seek out and confront this issue, can kind of subconsciously avoid doing this. It's easy to bump into one passage at a time, at most kind of recognizing that something you're reading seems different from something you read somewhere else. But unless you decide to pursue it further, it's all too easy to brush the issue aside, to never go back and look. It's easy to accept the pat answer given to you by a pastor or apologist and consider the question settled without ever really digging deeper. Occasionally, very occasionally, you might run up against a real puzzler where you have to twist the meaning of the passages so hard that deep down you kind of know you're fooling yourself. But then you can always just retreat and let it sit at the back of your mind as an abstraction. I think this is how most Christians handle Bible contradictions. And by all appearances, Mr. Butt's video is just a cynically crafted tool for helping them do this. It spends well over a third of its runtime just strawmanning atheism and assuring his audience of the Bible's consistency. Then when he finally gets around to the topic, he gives 2 examples that he explains away by appealing to nuanced meaning of words in the original language, knowing his audience will be soothed by the mere possibility of an explanation regardless of the fact that they don't know enough to check and never would anyway. And he wraps up with a 3rd example in which one verse names 2 people and the other names 3. Because Mr. Butt knows that if he points out this technically isn't an unavoidable semantic contradiction, his audience will breathe a sigh of relief and consider the issue settled, giving no thought whatsoever to the fact that these passages are clumsily ambiguous next to each other, that leaving one person out of an account is pointless and f***ing weird, and that God could have inspired the Bible to be much more crystal clear in its consistency but just didn't. He does this while ignoring way more compelling examples of contradictions, because he doesn't want to address the topic at all. He's just pulling the wool over the eyes of his audience, an audience that lets him do it because they don't want to look too closely at the Bible. But isn't this basically apologetics in a nutshell? Once more, a big thank you goes out to my patrons, including Council of Zod members SR Foxley and Q. If you want to join them or otherwise be up to date on announcements or random little things I like to say, please find the Patreon and social media links below. I'm planning on offering early Wednesday previews of my videos when possible, so patrons and potential patrons can look out for that. Anyway, thank you, and Zod bless Krypton.